Hey students, this video is going to talk to you about different types of evidence. Now when we think of evidence, oftentimes we think of percentages, data, facts, maybe a good authoritative quote or two. However, there's many different ways that evidence is used by writers to persuade their audience to follow a specific message. And so the three types of evidence that we're going to look at today is used in both fiction and nonfiction writing. And that is the analogy, the allusion, and the anecdote. So let's start with the analogy. So an analogy is when you compare two complex concepts to one another in order to help an audience better understand one or both of the concepts. So here we have an example that reads, sword is to a warrior as pen is to a writer. It's comparing the writer to a warrior and the pen of a writer to the sword of the warrior. Therefore, it's comparing two concepts. Now you might be saying, well, this guy that's a metaphor. It's not a metaphor. It's very similar. You're correct. But there are some differences, one significant one, and that's the difference between an analogy compares two concepts and a metaphor compares two unlike things. So here, if we were going to break this analogy down into metaphors, it would be broken down into two different metaphors. The first would be the writer was a warrior. It's comparing two unlike things, the writer and the warrior, in order to help us better understand one of the things, the writer. In this case, the speaker would be persuading us to understand that writers too can incite change like warriors, except not through violent means. So that is a metaphor. Now, the second metaphor is the pen was a sword. Here we have two unlike things being compared to help us better understand one of the things. The speaker would want us to know that the pen can incite change like a sword, but again, without violent means. So we have two metaphors here. Notice the difference between those and the analogy. The sword is to a warrior as a pen is to the writer. It's creating two concepts and comparing them to help us better understand both of those concepts. Another way that you can check to see if you have an analogy on your hand is by using this formula. The sword is to a warrior as a pen is to a writer. This is oftentimes how analogies are written out. So let's take a look at a second example. Withdrawal of U.S. troops will become like salted peanuts to the American public. The more U.S. troops come home, the more will be demanded. So here we have an analogy set up that says the withdrawal of troops is to salted peanuts, as more troops coming home is to demanding more peanuts. So why would the author do this? What is the purpose of creating an analogy like this? Well, the purpose is usually logical in nature, and it's used to further a line of reasoning or draw an inference by using comparative or parallel cases. So let's apply that purpose to this example. So what the speaker has done is taken this very simple concept of a salted peanut. Most of us understand what a salted peanut is. And most of us understand how people like salted peanuts. On an airplane, you get one bag, you just want more bags of salted peanuts. So the speaker takes this very easy to understand concept and compares it to a very difficult to understand concept, which is the withdrawal of U.S. troops and the greater desire to withdraw more troops. So by comparing this simple concept to a more difficult concept, the author is creating a logical argument where if we agree with this simple reasoning, we can therefore agree with the more complex reasoning, and therefore is comparative and persuasive. Now, when we talk about logical fallacies later on, you'll learn about how an analogy like this is technically a logical fallacy because this just can't be proven. There's no actual correlation between salted peanuts and U.S. troops. However, the speaker is still making that comparison through an analogy in order to persuade his audience. So that's an analogy. Let's move on to our second term, which is the allusion. So let's take a look at this example of an allusion. Oh, and remember, an allusion is a reference to a famous person, place, or thing. So keep that in mind as we look at this example. This quote reads, "And finally, you're all familiar with Dr. Ian Wilmot's cloned sheep." We actually miss the real story behind this. We're so interested in talking about when this will happen with humans. The real story behind the sheep is that Dr. Wilmot created the prototype for bio-industrial design. He's the Henry Ford of the biotech century. Did you see where the allusion was? The reference to the famous person, place, or thing? Did you see it? All right. It's right here. He's the Henry Ford of the biotech century. So, hopefully, you know who Henry Ford is, because that would help detect where that allusion was. But here's Henry Ford, the inventor of the Ford car. So, Henry Ford is being compared here to Dr. Ian Wilmot, and that is an allusion. Henry Ford is a famous person, and by relating Dr. Ian Wilmot, the speaker is creating the argument that just as Henry Ford was a leader of the automotive design, Wilmot will also be a leader of the bio-industrial design. So allusions are also comparative in nature. Now you might be saying, well, isn't that like a metaphor? No. It's unlike a metaphor, one, because, well, these aren't being directly compared, but also because it's using the famous person, place, or thing. So I guess you could have something that combines a metaphor with an allusion, but if it's using a famous person, place, or thing, it is an allusion. Okay? So, what is the purpose? Well, it's to simplify complex ideas or emotions. This guy is a pretty complex guy, and what he's doing is a pretty complex thing. He's cloning sheep. I don't even know where to begin with explaining how that would happen. However, Henry Ford and his creation of the car is a little bit easier to understand. The changes that the car made to the average individual's life are really, really significant, and we have Henry Ford to thank for those changes. Therefore, what the speaker is saying is that what Wilmot has created is going to make huge changes to the daily lives of people everywhere, and he is the one to thank for that. So, it's comparing these two individuals in order to convey a complex idea through a more simplified manner. Now, what's the problem with this? Well, some of you may have already encountered the problem, and that's the fact that we may not recognize or understand the allusion. If you don't know who the person is, or what the place is, or what the thing is, you might not even know where the allusion is, let alone what the allusion's trying to say. So that's a problem that allusions have when being used as evidence. If people don't pick up on the cultural connotations of that allusion, they might miss the point that the reader or the writer and the speaker are trying to make. So let's move on to our last term, and that is the anecdote. So an anecdote is a brief story that's often meant to be humorous or informative. So let's take a look at this example. This example comes from Stella Young, who's a comedian with a disability. And she explained, "At high school, I just wanted to fit in with my non-disabled friends. I didn't like hanging out with other people with disabilities. But walking to class with friends, invariably I'd have to duck off and find the accessible entrance. And I'd get really worried about rejoining the conversation. I'd pretend I hadn't missed huge chunks. I'd be all, oh yes, yes, of course." So here, what Stella Young is doing is using a story about her past when she was in high school to make a bigger argument about the experience of having a physical disability. So the argument you could make, well, the argument that she may be making, if we read into it, is the idea that just simple things such as conversations can pose problems to people with physical disabilities that other people may not even ever think of. So it's asking us to be a little more perceptive and understanding towards those who have different experiences than ours. And that whole argument is conveyed through this anecdote. So you can kind of see it as making an argument through examples, which can be very persuasive because you're not telling people what to think, you're showing them what to think. Now, what's the purpose? It's humor and or a connection. So one, little stories can be kind of funny and they make us laugh. Oh, what a good little story. And that draws in our attention where we want to listen to the person speaking or the person writing because they have good stories and everyone loves a good story. The other purpose can be connection. By telling a story, we become connected to the speaker. We become connected to the writer. We care about what they have to say, and therefore we're going to be a lot more open to the argument that they're making through that story. All right, so let's review. We have anecdotes, which are brief stories meant to create humor or connection with the audience. We also have allusions, which are references to famous person, place, or things that are used comparatively in order to help us better understand a complex concept. And then we have an analogy, which very similarly compares two concepts to better help us understand a complex concept. The difference is that analogies don't reference famous people, places, or things. All right, well, I hope this helped. Good luck with your types of evidence power focus.